a perfect soundtrack for the space that we're inhabiting here tonight, and that I believe should be the space that all of us inhabit, that space called politics. You know, I speak a lot, I try to speak a lot on this campaign at churches, synagogues, universities, yoga studios. And why is that? It's because I want to be in places where a different kind of thinking is prevalent. A different kind of thinking is incubated. Because we need to be deeper thinkers today. We need to be very sober about the world today. We need to be deep, we need to be wise, and we need to be reflective. And politics as we know it is a very narrow container emotionally and psychologically. It's even a narrow container intellectually. It is filled with old thought forms that don't necessarily even serve anymore. It is filled with all kinds of artificial polarities and dichotomies that don't necessarily describe what's true anymore. And most importantly, there's no love there. It is so filled with anger. It is so filled with dishonor. It is so filled with mean-spiritedness. And as Einstein said, we will not solve the problems of the world from the level of thinking that we were at when we created them. Gandhi also said that actually it was Gandhi who said that the end is inherent in the means. We will not be able to bring forth the kind of results that we need to in this country and in this world today until we ourselves deepen into a wiser, more reflective, and as I said, more sober place. So that's the first thing we want to do. We want to realize that for a country, just like for an individual, if something big happens, if there's a crisis, and I think that all of us would agree, regardless of how we describe the crisis, or regardless of how we would name the problem, all of us would agree that something really big has happened, and that we're going through a crisis here. Now, what happens when we as individuals hear bad news, or maybe we don't hear it suddenly, maybe it creeps up upon us, but whatever it is, we all know the feeling of, wait, I have to think about this. You don't just immediately react. You go, whoa, I have to process this. Am I wrong? You have to like find where you live within it. And that's what we have to be regarding the times in which we live. Life is not just about what happens to you. Life is about who you choose to be in the space of what has happened to you. And that's how we have to look at our citizenship today. Before we jump into, this is what happened, no, I think this is what happened, or this is what we need to do, versus, no, this is what I think we need to do, we all have to drop into a place about who we need to be at this time. Now, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, my father fought in World War II. That was my parents' generation. I heard many stories. I've read my history, seen a lot of things on TV about it, and there was a way in which, once Pearl Harbor was attacked, there was a simplicity to the horror. We knew what had happened. The Japanese had attacked us. And the next day, all young men, and some men who weren't so young, went to the draft office. It was a no-brainer. And we knew what we had to do. We had to fight the Japanese. It was pretty clear. And Franklin Roosevelt went to Congress, and he said that our generation, he said, referring to his own, had a rendezvous with destiny. Everybody knew what that meant, and everybody knew what they had to do. This is a different moment. You can liken that moment to a malignant tumor that was operable. They knew what the tumor was, they knew they had to cut it out, and I think we can all agree they did so brilliantly. What faces us is more like a cancer that's already metastasized. It's not necessarily operable because it's like a cancer that's wrapped around some healthy organs. You don't want to blow up your government. You don't want to blow up your economy. You've just got, it's gnarlier than that, right? It's like we have to see where is the corruption, where is not the corruption, what is it we have to save, what is it we need to cut out. It takes some this is a far more nuanced moment in that sense. I'm not saying it's more profound or less profound. I'm saying actually it is as profound. But it calls for a more holistic healing modality. It calls for us to have the same courage, that the generation that fought World War II had. It certainly calls us to be as focused on the moment as that generation was. Nobody thought they could sit out World War II. Whether you were a man or you were a woman, nobody, or a child. I mean, it was everywhere. It was an ubiquitous phenomenon. It affected everyone. Nobody got to say, well, you know, I'm just not into World War II. It's just not my thing, because I'm not political. And nobody got to say that. It was happening to the country. The country knew that it was happening. And also, they didn't fight World War II as Democrats versus Republicans. So we... So I think what has happened over the last few decades is some of the people who are the most heartfelt, who are the most nuanced in our thinking, who are the most spiritually progressive, people into transformation, whether it's spiritual, religious, psychotherapeutic, AA, whatever, have been very turned off by politics. And we've been very turned off by politics for all the reasons that I just said. We're opening ourselves to a more integrative, 21st century perspective, whole person, the recognition that life is multidimensional, the recognition that there are psychological and emotional and spiritual issues we need to face and to deal with in our lives. We realize how important that is, and then politics is stuck. It's stuck back there in this 20th century model. It's not even the century we're living in. Very external. It's all about treating the symptom rather than the cause, filled with anger, filled with corruption of money that just got worse and worse and worse, and power games, and we never know who's telling the truth, and it's like high school theater, but bad high school theater, the whole thing. And so that's made a lot of the best, most forward-thinking people in America disengage. I don't want anything to do with that. So look what happened. Because the more the best thinkers began to disengage, the more toxic it became. Because it was just left to people who weren't bringing any kind of transformative ideas into the field, which only made more transformational thinkers disengage more, which only made it more toxic, which only created more chronic disengagement on the part of more inspired and enlightened thinkers, which only made it more toxic to the point where we are where we are today. Now, I don't feel that among the people that I just mentioned, more enlightened thinkers, that there's a feeling of to hell with politics now. Not now. Everybody knows. Everybody knows. Whoa, this is serious. I don't feel that the American people are unaware or uncaring about what's happening now. But I do feel, and people are right to feel this way, that nobody wants to go back into it if it means going back into the thing which we found toxic, particularly today, because we know in our guts and we know in our hearts that there will be no transformation coming from that field. I'm running for president of the United States because we can recreate that field and make things right. In my 35-year career, a career which I'm sure many of you know something about, people don't usually come to me because things are going well. People don't call and just say, things are going so good, I thought maybe we could sit down and talk. Usually it's, could I possibly have an appointment with you, a session with you? And I know what that means. They just got bad news. The test results came back and it's cancer. Their child is addicted and it's heroin. The business is going under. They're bankrupt. The spouse has left. They didn't even expect it. And I've seen something from the privilege of working so up close and personal with people for the last 35 years during times of crisis. That's more often than not when people become their most intelligent. Because in the first 5 minutes, so many ultimately unimportant things that we allow to preoccupy us just fall away. All the things we thought were important an hour ago, we still get they're not important now. And we are razor focused on what matters. And we are also razor focused on listening to whoever has wisdom and insight about the problem. If your doctor did a test, you don't expect the doctor to lie to you. And you don't expect the doctor, if it's stage 1 cancer, to say, it's only stage 1, so let's not focus on it because that's negative. Some things grow not because you focus on them, but because you don't focus on them. And so you expect the doctor to be real with you. You expect the doctor to be honest with you. And then having heard everything you need to hear from the doctor, together you're going to discuss healing options. But our politics isn't like that. Our politicians too often feel that there's danger in being too honest with you, that you won't like them for that it will appear negative, that somehow we should pour pink paint. You know, it's a politics of people-pleasing. It's not so much radical truth-telling as it is figuring out what your group. I'm told your group wants to hear this. I'm told your group wants to hear that. Ooh, you're black. I hear blacks want to hear this. Ooh, you're gay. I hear gay people want to hear this. Ooh, you're women. I hear women want to hear this. So we're not sometimes going into the deeper conversation, because you're black and you're American, you're Jewish and you're American, you're a woman and you're American, you're gay and you're American. We're not having the deepest conversation that we need to be having right now. Not that those others aren't important, but we need to be having a conversation about being American and where America is right now and where we need to go. Now, to me, the biggest problem is that there is not a realization necessarily of what's actually happening. There's so much concentration on the trees that we're not looking at the forest. So I want to tell you, particularly because how many of you are Iowa voters? Well, hopefully you have friends in Iowa. What is going to happen is that people are going to start voting at the caucuses, February 3rd in Iowa. And when that caucus, people go to their caucus, people go to their, and you will have your primary, your primary state, right, Nebraska. You will decide if you're a Democrat or if you're an independent or Republican who's going to be voting in your primary or caucus, who you think is the best person to take us forward into the next period of time. Now, I'm not running against anyone. I'm running with a lot of really wonderful people. I am running as a Democrat, and I can tell you that I believe that all of the Democrats are telling you the truth. That's not the problem. The problem is not that people aren't telling the truth. The problem is that it's more like a court of law where you raise your hand and you swear to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It's not that they're not telling the truth, but the modern political establishment does not tell the whole truth. It does not tell nothing but the truth. And that is what we need to do now. It's not a matter. And so as someone who is standing before you, hoping for your support, I want to tell you the truth as I see it. Where I feel America has been, where I feel America is, where I feel America should go, and how I would lead us in doing that. Number one, I think some really, really big problems started about 40 years ago. Some of us are old enough to remember, and some of us aren't. About 40 years ago, the United States became enamored. Millions and billions of dollars were spent on making sure that we would become enamored. We were at the effect of politicians and all kinds of think tanks and all kinds of forces in our society, which presented us this idea of trickle-down economics. Now, trickle-down economics, I don't have a problem calling myself a capitalist, but as it turns out, trickle-down economics is a virulent strain of capitalism. And why do I say that? Well, the idea was that if all you did was have the government get out of the way and let corporations do everything possible to increase the short-term profit of its stockholders, that would somehow be great for everybody. Because they would become so rich, see, and they would create all these jobs. And so all of this wealth would trickle down and it would lift all boats. Well, I think after 40 years, the jury's in after 40 years. And this trickle-down theory, this is what it actually did. It did not lift all boats. It left millions of people without even a life raft. It has created the largest wealth inequality since 1929. It has destroyed our middle class. And it has created a situation where 1% of Americans control more wealth than the bottom 90%. Now, some people might look at a career like mine and say, I don't think anybody would say, why do you care? But people would say, but that's not your lane, Ms. Williamson. Well, let me say this. There's a story I heard once that affected me a lot. And I think of it as a story much like the difference between the Good Samaritan and what you might call the conscious Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is walking down the road, and the Good Samaritan sees a beggar. The Good Samaritan sees a beggar, and the Good Samaritan gives some alms to the beggar. And then the Good Samaritan walks down the road some more, and the Good Samaritan sees another beggar, gives them alms. The Good Samaritan sees another beggar and gives them alms. Good Samaritan walks down the road, sees another beggar, and gives them alms. And at a certain point, the Good Samaritan says to him or herself, why are there so many beggars? And that is what has happened to me over the last 15 years. I understand that into every life some rain must fall. I understand that people die. I understand that we lose loved ones. I understand people get divorced. I understand jobs go wrong. I understand cancer happens. I understand people get sick. I understand all that. But over the last 15 years, I've seen too many people who are suffering, who theoretically, in the richest country in the world, should not be suffering. Too many people who do everything right, who work hard, get up in the morning, they work hard, they try to raise their kids, they do everything possible, and they can't make it on just one job. They have to have 2 jobs or 3 jobs. They're working at jobs they don't even like because it's the only way they can make it with the health insurance that they need, or they're working at careers that they don't really want to be on, but they don't know how to pay off their college loans otherwise. They're so tired at the end of the night, they don't have the bandwidth or the energy to be there for their partner, for their spouse, or for their child to say, Mommy or Daddy, read me a story. And then we're all surprised at all this societal dysfunction that is almost inevitable, emerging like from this petri dish of human despair and human anxiety and tension. You have 93 million people living in near poverty in the richest country in the world. 93 million people who live every day not knowing what will happen if they get sick. 93 million people living every single day not knowing what will happen if one of their children gets sick, or how they will possibly send their children to college, or how they will get out from under these college loans. This is not just data. When you talk about 1% and 99%, or 1% and 90%, you talk about the destruction of the middle class, these are human beings we're talking about here. Now, I have been in the field of spirituality, but the field of spirituality has a goal that is absolutely the same a thing that should be the goal of politics, and that is the amelioration of human suffering. Gandhi said that anybody who doesn't think religion has anything to do with politics doesn't understand religion. Because there is no serious religious or spiritual path anywhere that gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. There is nothing holy about complacency. There's nothing negative about yelling fire if, in fact, the house is burning down. And ladies and gentlemen, our house is burning down. This is as serious a moment as my parents' generation faced when Pearl Harbor was attacked. We have, over the last 40 years, transitioned. We are not now a vital democracy. We are not functioning as a vital democracy. We are not now a government that is functioning of the people, by the people, and for the people. And when people come to me and they sit on my couch and they need to talk about what's been that crisis in their life, one of the things they know they're going to get from me is we're going to have to tell the truth now. We're going to have to be real now. What'd you do now? What part was yours now? What do you need to change now? We're going to look in the mirror now. You're going to be brutally honest with yourself now. You're going to atone for what you need to atone for now. You're going to make amends for what you need to make amends for now. And you're going to rise to the occasion now. And you're not going to play victim or weak now. And you're not going to be distracted now because you need to save your life now, and you're going to show up and you're going to be available to change, and then breakthroughs are going to happen, even miracles are going to happen. That is what happened to people, and that is what can happen to this country. Because that has happened, and we need to look at that straight in the mirror. In 1776, we repudiated aristocracy. Aristocracy, we all learned about this as kids. We repudiated it because it meant only a few people got to win. And we were going to form a country where that wasn't what was going to happen. It wasn't going to be just a few people who would get to win. Everybody was created equal. Everybody, and God gave all men inalienable rights of life and of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. That was radical. It was radical then and it's radical now. Then the Declaration of Independence went on to say that the government is instituted to secure those rights, and that when the government's not doing its job, it is the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it. What has happened to our revolutionary spirit? What has happened to our rambunctiousness? Sometimes the only rambunctious people I see are Trump supporters. We should all be rambunctious. As it turns out, the American Revolution is an ongoing process. It is a process that must be nourished and renourished and activated and reactivated with every generation. You know, in the Jewish religion, it says that every generation must discover God for itself. And every generation of Americans must decide for itself, do we or do we not mean this stuff? Because if it's just on marble walls somewhere, or it's just written on parchment, and we have it behind glass in Washington somewhere, then it loses its moral force. It has to be in us. We have to say in our time, no, we mean that. We're actually going to do that. We're actually going to do that. And let's not forget, out of the 54 men who were brave, I'll give it to you, they were brave, because if the King of England had won that war, they would have been executed as traitors. But 41 of them were slave owners. So you see, we've always been both. We've always been both. It is the American story. We have this characterological dichotomy. We are both a country that is founded on the most aspirational principles that have ever formed the founding of a nation. The very idea, and like I said, it's a radical idea, that anybody should be able to soar. That anybody, no matter who they were, no matter who their parents, no matter their color, no matter their religion, no matter their sex, their sexuality, that's the ongoing seeking to form a more perfect union. We are seeking the full manifestation of that ideal that anybody, that God said anybody. We've never totally achieved it, but not only have we not totally achieved it, we've always had in every generation from the very beginning those who would actively work against it. We are both a country founded on these most amazing principles, and we have forces within us who are most violent transgressors against those ideas. What has happened in our time is what has happened in many times. And over history, the narrative is that we tend to push back on anti-democratic forces. We had slavery, and then a generation rose up and abolished slavery. We had the suppression of women, and a generation rose up. We've had two major waves of feminism and the suffragette movement and the establishment of the 19th Amendment. We had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South, and then a generation rose up with the civil rights movement. We're not any different. It's the same stuff, just reiterated, rebranded. The question before us is, are we going to be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to make sure democracy is alive and well in our time? Louis Brandeis, a late Supreme Court justice, said you can have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a few, or you can have democracy. You cannot have both. And so that's what's happened. We're not of the people, by the people, for the people anymore. We're of, by, and for a new aristocracy. Just like people can regress, our country's regressed. We're functioning as an aristocracy. It's a corporate aristocracy. It's health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies, chemical companies, gun manufacturers, food companies, oil and gas, defense contractors. Their ability through the money with which they lobby is so great that basically, for all intents and purposes, our government is a system of legalized bribery now. And our government does more to advocate for the short-term profits for these huge multinational corporations than it does to advocate for us. That it does to advocate for our health, our safety, our well-being, the safety and health and well-being of our children, the safety and health and well-being of other people in the world, and the safety and health and well-being of this planet. At what point are we going to do what the abolitionists did? Are we going to do what the women's suffragettes did? Are we going to do what the civil rights movement did, which, by the way, the government did not do? The government didn't say, let's free the slaves. The government didn't say, let's give women the right to vote. The government didn't say, let's desegregate. It was the abolitionist movement, which came from early evangelicals and Quakers. It was the women suffragettes, many of whom were Quakers. And it was the civil rights movement led by a Baptist preacher. Notice the through line there of people who stood up because they knew right from wrong, they knew democracy from no democracy, and they said, stop right there. No, actually, it's not okay that our water is filled with contaminants, and our food is filled with carcinogens, and our air is filled with toxins, and our earth is being desecrated, and we are spending more on ways to prepare war than we are even thinking about in ways of preparing for peace. It is not okay that 13 million children are hungry in the richest country in the world. It is not okay that 100,000 of them are homeless. It is not okay that millions of American children go to school every single day, and they are in classrooms that don't even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. It is not okay, particularly because we know that if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, then the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. It is not okay. And it is not okay the way our government just normalizes the despair of these children. And it is particularly not okay why they normalize the despair of these children. You see, these children aren't old enough to vote. So they're no constituency. These children aren't old enough to work, so they don't have any financial leverage. So how can they possibly compete with the cloud of all that corporate money that dominates Washington? And yet, the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. Where is the right of those children to pursue happiness? We have children in elementary school in this country who ask the teacher, do you have any food for me? We have children in elementary school in the United States who are on suicide watch. We have only one mental health counselor for every 1,500 children. We need trauma-informed therapy. We need trauma-informed education. We need wraparound services. We need mental health for these children and for their parents. We need anti-bullying. We need violence prevention. We need social and emotional learning. We need meditative practice and mindfulness in the schools. We need a massive realignment of investment in the direction of America's children. We need a mother in the White House, and you can take that however you want. The first thing we need to do is to recognize how immoral it is to base our educational funding primarily on property taxes. That's left over from some former time. It's a bad idea from the 20th century. Actually, it's a bad idea from the 19th century. Because you see, when our economic system was invented, women were not a voice in the public sphere. And so taking care of children was just seen kind of as women's work. You know, it was just kind of, it was peripheral. And then the more that this industrial economy, and particularly trickle-down economics, trickle-down economics, like I said, I'm not an anti-capitalist at all. I just believe capitalism should have a conscience. Every institution should display ethics and public morality just like every individual should. If conscience should dictate our individual behavior, then conscience should dictate our collective behavior as well. But this virulent strain of capitalism has no use for children, and it has no use for the elderly. And those are the two parts of our population that are constantly given short shrift by a government that has become handmaiden to this virulent strain of capitalism. Children because they can't serve it yet, and older people because this system says, well, they've already served us, we don't have any further use. And so both groups in too many times are kept in little more than survival. That needs to change. We need to stop the fact that children are educated according to the finances of their parents. Every school in America should be a palace of learning and culture and the arts. That should be our national goal. And as far as older people, as long as we're on the subject, older people, we shouldn't be just saving Social Security. We should be expanding Social Security. We should be scrapping the cap All of us should pay into it. And the UBI, the Universal Basic Income that Andrew Yang and others have been talking about, I totally agree on that, and that should not stop at 65. If we really want an amazing 21st century, and this is what I want, that's what we need to be thinking about. No individual should be only thinking about him or herself, and no generation should only be thinking about ourselves. We should be thinking about this country 40 years from now, 50 years from now, for the rest of this century. If you really want an amazing century, I'll tell you what you do. You want an amazing economy 10 years from now? Take better care of your 10-year-olds today. There is no power in the sun, there's no power in the wind, there's no power under the ground that can begin to match the power in the brain of every child. That's what we should be developing. That is the key to our future. But there are a lot of other things we have to look in the mirror about as well. We have to face the facts. And the fact is that if we don't take radical action to deal with reversal of climate change in the next 7 years, we could be facing, and once again, this is not a conversation that should just be up here. We gotta be integrative here. We gotta take this into our hearts. If we do not act within 7 years, it is a consensus of the scientists of the world that we could face within 15 to 20 years a level of social collapse unseen in the modern era. Have you looked at all the pictures of Venice, Italy from the last few days? And that's particularly sad because it's one of the great art treasures of the world. Imagine if that starts happening all over. If we do not take radical action within the next 7 years, we could have entire swaths of countries, possibly even swaths of continents, that are uninhabitable due to the heat. And if land is too hot for people to live there, obviously it's too hot to grow food. So you'd have massive food shortages. You'd have economic collapse. And then you'd have the real doozy, which is those people would be on the move because they wouldn't have any place to live. We could have hundreds of millions of climate refugees. We have 63 million displaced persons on the planet right now, which is the worst humanitarian crisis, refugee crisis since World War II. Imagine hundreds of millions. Oh, you think we have some issues now with boats that have capsized near Italy or in the Mediterranean or a wall on the southern border? You think it's bad now? We must have a World War II mass mobilization. And this is the thing. Americans are hardwired for great things. Americans are not hardwired for small things. Our eyes glaze over. All politicians give us is, we should have this particular policy and this particular percentage and this and that, and we're going to tweak it here and we're going to tweak it there, and I'm bored. Even when I was in the debate, I was bored. I was like, really? Really? This is America. I thought we did great things. I thought we did big things. You know, America is like a plane. It's like an airplane. You know, when in the sky, a big jet, and when it's in the sky, it's like so awesome. But when it's on the runway, it's kind of a big clunky piece of metal, you know? Or an amazing sports car when you see it on the open road and it's like, whoa. But when you just see it in a residential neighborhood, he paid what? Right? So we don't do small well. We were born out of a big idea. That's in our national character. We're not beige, we're purple. You know, we're big. So give us a big goal, and we do better with a big goal than we do with a small goal. So I have a big goal for you. Save your country and save your planet. And with everything that I'm talking to you about tonight, we have the people. You have them here. I'm sure you have them in Omaha because you have them everywhere I go. We have the teachers. We have the social workers. We have the mental health counselors. We have the school counselors. We have the experts in childhood education. We have the environmentalists. We have the environmentalists who know how to handle what's going on in Nebraska. We have the environmentalists who know what's going on in California. We have the environmentalists who know what to do in South Carolina. We have the environmentalists who know what to do with the coastal regions. We have the environmentalists who know what to do with wildfires. We have environmentalists who know what to do with flooding and with wetlands, every single issue that we have. And I'm going to talk to you about two major ones more. We have the people. The issue is that our government does not focus or fund the problem solvers. The government focuses on and funds the problem creators. That's not going to change until we step in. Don't expect the political status quo to repair itself. The whole point of a political status quo is that it lives to perpetuate itself. That's how it operates. And even very, very nice people working within it, once you're within that system, it's such a corrupt system. It's not about individuals. It's about the system and how the system operates. And there is a political industrial complex. Trust me. Next thing we need to talk about is like war and peace. Excuse me, I've been in a political campaign. I'm sure you've heard some other candidates. Other than Tulsi Gabbard, is anybody even talking about it? We become Stepford citizens. You know, when I was a kid, we used to be Stepford wives. You will do this. Now, we will talk about what you want to talk about. I was looking at a list today. What issues are you concerned with? I didn't see children there. I didn't see poverty there. I didn't see war and peace there. We're even told what we're supposed, and I didn't see race there. Nothing that's inconvenient to the system. So, war and peace. This is your money. So when I tell you these things, remember this. This is your money. You spend $760 billion a year on your military budget, $40 billion a year on your State Department. Now, State Department is diplomacy, mediation, and development. And then within the State Department, there's $17 billion that's called the USAID. And the USAID is humanitarian assistance and long-term development. And then in addition to the USAID, also within the $40 billion State Department budget, is less than $1 billion of peace building. Now, think about how we have transformed our ideas of medicine over the last few decades. We don't just take medicine. We know we have to cultivate health. Well, you can't just endlessly prepare for war. You have to cultivate peace. Sickness is the absence of health. Health is not the absence of sickness. And war is the absence of peace. Peace is not the absence of war. We have to cultivate peace. We can't just address symptoms. All that the political system as it now exists does is it addresses symptoms. It doesn't address cause. Even all this mental health stuff. Oh, they're going to help us now with the mental health crisis. But when you have 93 million people who live in near poverty and have chronic economic anxiety every day, when you have millions of children who are scared of when the next shooting might happen, millions of parents who worry dropping off their children every day, but you have a government that will not even stand up to the NRA, and then this government is coming around to tell us we will do something about the mental health crisis. I have an idea for you guys. Stop driving everybody crazy. People are like this in America. We've got the richest country in the world, and people are walking around like this. People are so constricted. People are so anxious. People are so tense. This is not the way it's supposed to be. And I feel this is part of being of a certain age, you know, when you feel you become keeper of the story. This is why I like to go to colleges and universities. I want to say to young people, it wasn't always this way. It wasn't always this way. I said to a friend of mine recently, I never thought I'd say this, but I miss the 70s. And I'm not romanticizing American society or American capitalism or American government before the 80s. But this particular virulence, this particular craziness, this particular hijacking of our very value system, it did begin in the 1980s with this trickle-down economic theory, whereby we simply put too much of the national wealth into the hands of a very few people, squeezing too many other people. To the point where, whether it's the water we're drinking, whether it's the pesticides, whether that they're legalizing, whatever it is. And so now on the issue of war and peace, we have to do more than just endlessly prepare for war. When you have a profit-making, that's the problem, you know, with a profit-making healthcare system. And you probably heard me talk about it at one of the debates. We don't have a healthcare system, we have a sickness care system. We talk about how we're going to pay for healthcare. We need to be talking also about why are we so sick? Why are so many Americans chronically ill with things like obesity and diabetes and allergies and asthma compared to people in other countries? Well, when you look at how deregulated the chemical companies, the food companies, you know, when McDonald's sells a French fry in France, it's completely different than a French fry in the United States. Why? Because the French protect their food for their citizens. But here, it's the money of the pharmaceutical companies, the money of the health insurance companies. That's why we don't have universal health care. It's the money of the food companies. It's the money of the chemical companies. That's why there's so many contaminants in air and food. And it is the money from the defense contractors. That is why we spend so much more money on ways to prepare for war and so little comparatively on ways to wage peace. Now, this is not a criticism of the U.S. military. I'm a fan of the U.S. military. My father fought in war. These are not military decisions that are the problem here. These are political decisions. I believe that the U.S. military should have every dollar that it says it needs for our legitimate security. But you and I are being really fooled and really foolish if any of us think that there are not hundreds of billions of dollars above and beyond what the military says they need that just has for short-term profit maximization for defense contractors. Because just like there is so much money to be made on sickness, there is so much money to be made on war. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, this isn't going to stop unless we stop it. It's not going to stop unless and until the people step in. That's why I want a United States Department of Peace. Yes, we should have a Defense Department. We should also have a Department of Peace. Yes, we should have a military academy. We should also have a peace academy. And when you sit around with your national security agenda, if I'm President of the United States, yes, I want to hear from the military people. I also want to hear from the peace creators, from the peace builders. Because peace building is as sophisticated an expertise and skill set as is military arts. People who go and sometimes have to display just as much courage when you see some of the places where they go. And there are 4 factors which, when displayed, indicate statistically there will be a higher incidence of peace and a lower incidence of conflict. Expanded economic opportunities for women, expanded educational opportunities for children, the reduction of violence against women, and an amelioration of unnecessary human despair. Desperate people should be seen as a national security risk, whether it's a corner of a city here or a far-off corner of the world. Ameliorate unnecessary human suffering, and this is the preventative medicine that we need. You cut it off at the beginning. You nip it in the bud. People who are not living in survival are more likely to be able to create the conditions of peace among themselves. So for me, whether it's domestic policy or international policy, all public policy should be built around one core principle: what is it that helps people thrive? Now, there's only one other major issue that I want to talk about here, and that has to do with race. I want America to end an aberrational chapter of our history and begin a new one. And my career for 35 years has been how to apply transformational principles to practical circumstances. And all that a country is a group of people. So the same psychological and spiritual and emotional dynamics that prevail within the journey of one person prevail within the journey of a nation. And one of those principles is, you're not going to have a limitless future unless you're willing to clean up the past. This is why Catholics go to confession. It's why the holiest day of the year for Jews is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It's why in Alcoholics Anonymous, people take a fearless moral inventory and admit the exact nature of their character defects. But the whole concept of atonement from a spiritual and religious perspective is, once you admit it, once you atone, and once you're willing to make amends, then it's like a cosmic reset. People make mistakes, even do terrible things. Country make mistakes and even do terrible things, but you clean it up to the best of your ability. Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations since World War II. It doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, but it has gone very far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. In paying reparations for slavery, I also remind you, it's an economic stimulus. My plan is $500 billion dispersed over a period of 20 years. It would be dispersed to a reparations council made up of black leaders, obviously themselves descendants of enslaved persons here. And whether they apply the money to historically black colleges or degentrification efforts or venture capital for minority businesses should be their decision, not ours. That's part of the power of reparations. If I owe you money, I don't get to tell you how to spend it. The stipulation on the part of the US government should be this, that the money must be used for purposes of educational and economic renewal. You know, the difference between race-based policies and reparations is that race-based policies are a continuation of the paternalism. I mess with you, I will tell you how I'm going to fix you. Reparations are something different. They carry a moral force because reparations carry an inherent mea culpa, an inherent acknowledgement of a wrong that has been done and a debt that is owed and the willingness on the part of a people to pay it. This will be a blessing on our children and our children's children. Race in America is like a toxic baton. We just take one generation, hands it to the next, hands it to the next, hands it to the next. I feel that the American people are a decent people. We are a good people. I just feel that a lot of people in America, probably the majority of white people, are undereducated about the history of race in the United States. And when... And when you do a little thumbnail history, first slave ships brought over in 1619. Slavery not abolished till 1865. That's almost 250 years. And then after that, except for 12 years of Reconstruction, where the federal troops were stationed in the South to ensure that slavery would not be reconstituted, there was another 100 years after the Civil War of institutionalized violence against black people. What do you call lynchings? What do you call Ku Klux Klan if not domestic terrorism? And throughout the South, they passed, after the Civil War, they were called black code laws to ensure subpar economic and social and political opportunity for black people. That did not end until 100 years after the end of the Civil War with Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. So in 1964, we passed the Civil Rights Act to dismantle segregation. The next year, the Voting Rights Act to ensure that black people and all Americans could have equal access to the polls. But even then, since then, we have in some ways slid backwards. 2013, the John Roberts-led Supreme Court began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, which is why we have all those voter suppression efforts all over the country. We have racial disparity in criminal sentencing. We have mass incarceration. We have mandatory sentencing minimums, which should not exist and which do more to harm people of color than others. Ladies and gentlemen, let's do this. We have now established, it's been established that if black families made as much money as white families, and remember when you're talking about that disparity, you're talking about a black person who is as educated and has as much professional achievement as a white person. There is still an economic disparity. If black families made as much money as white families, this was recently established, our economy would be $1.5 trillion larger. This will be an economic stimulus, but even more importantly, it is the right thing to do. And we need to take reparative measures regarding Native Americans. We all know how many so many treaties that were unfairly negotiated, so many treaties that have been broken. We promised and I know what part of the country I'm in right now, but in 1863, we promised the Black Hills of South Dakota back to the Sioux. It was promised to them. It would not be messing with the government of South Dakota to give the vast majority back. We should not be siding with oil companies when it comes to these pipelines. We should not be siding. We should not be siding with any of these major corporate entities in terms of the exploitation of mineral rights, land rights, water rights of our native peoples. And we have to recognize that they are the poorest of the poor. We have to recognize that we've not cleaned up everything after a history of genocide, a history of cultural annihilation. I want to be a president who begins a season of repair. Because in our collective existence, just like in our personal lives, if you don't clean stuff up, it continues to poison. It just continues generation after generation after generation. And like I said, we're great people, we're good people, we're decent people. As far as being a great nation, however, you can't be great if you're not good. We have lost our moral compass. We're not treating each other well. We're not treating our children well. We're not treating people in other countries well. We're not cleaning up our historical wrongs. We can do all those things, but one element would make it a whole lot easier and a whole lot more probable: the right president. I hope you'll support me. Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much.